The most frightening night of my life began not with a scream, but with the mundane click of my dorm room door locking behind me, a sound that now echoes in my memory as the first in a series of traps being set. The decision to attend the university's annual winter bash was born from a simple desire to silence the relentless buzz of academic anxiety that had taken up residence in my skull during finals week, a noise no amount of caffeine or highlighted textbooks could drown out. The campus outside was a cathedral of brittle silence, transformed by a deep December freeze that glazed the pathways in black ice and seemed to press the very light from the security lamps into narrow cones of yellow against an overwhelming indigo darkness. I remember the crunch of my own boots on the salted pavement being the only sound, a rhythm that felt foolishly loud, as if I were announcing my solitary progression to anyone, or anything, listening from the Gothic arches of the empty chemistry building or the deep, blind windows of the library. This was my first mistake, though I didn't know it yet, believing I was alone in that transit. The party itself, upon reaching Mercer Commons, was a violent sensory shock. A wall of heat smelling of spilled beer, cheap pine-scented aerosol, and the cloying sweetness of mass-produced punch hit me first, followed by a blast of sound so dense it felt physical. Bodies packed every available inch, adorned in intentionally ugly sweaters that seemed to mock the genuine unease I'd carried in with me. Their laughter a sharp, percussive counterpoint to the thudding bass line that vibrated up through the floor. I waded in, a ship entering a chaotic, noisy harbor, and for a fleeting moment, the sheer normality of it, the cliché of it all, almost convinced me the cold knot in my stomach was just stress. But the feeling, that specific and unsettling sensation of being a distinct point of focus, began almost immediately. It was a cold pinpoint between my shoulder blades, a mental itch no amount of shifting could alleviate. As I accepted a red plastic cup from a stranger, my eyes instinctively scanned the roiling crowd not for friends, but for a face turned toward me, for a gaze that held a beat too long. The crowd's movements, which should have been random, began to feel subtly orchestrated around me. A path would clear just enough to grant me passage, only to seal shut behind, not with malice, but with an eerie efficiency, as if I were a stone moving through water and the water was consciously parting and closing. My conversations with classmates were exercises in split attention, my mouth forming pleasantries about exams and holiday plans while my mind screamed that the person brushing past my back had done so with a deliberate, assessing slowness. The touch, when it came, was so featherlight I initially ascribed it to the synthetic fiber of my jacket sleeve catching on itself. But the context was all wrong. It happened in a momentary pocket of relative stillness near a towering, poorly decorated tree, and the air around me cooled by a degree. My hand flew to my elbow, and I turned, expecting a smiling apology from a passerby. There was no one. Not a single person within 5 feet was moving away or even looking in my direction. Yet, in my right jacket pocket, which had been empty save for my keys, there was now a foreign weight. My fingers, numb with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, closed around a small, dense rectangle of paper, folded with obsessive, sharp creases. The process of withdrawing it felt like moving through syrup. Unfolding it was an act of profound dread. The message inside was not written in ink, but in a dark graphite gray, the letters carved into the page with such frantic pressure that the paper was torn in tiny furrows along the downstrokes. "Do not walk to your dorm alone." The block letters screamed up at me. Below, in a smaller, jagged script that tilted perilously, as if written on a trembling knee, it added, "He is at the tree." The word, "the," was underlined 3 times, the last line digging a small hole in the paper. My mind fragmented. Was this a joke? A cruel prank by someone who knew I was prone to anxiety? But the medium was all wrong. An anonymous, physical artifact slipped onto my person with a pickpocket skill in the middle of a crowded party. The evidence of palpable fear in the handwriting's violence argued against humor. This was a warning, a beacon of panic cast into my life by an unseen hand. And it held a specific geographic instruction, the tree. There was only one tree that commanded such a definite article on this part of campus. The massive, ancient oak in the central courtyard, known as the Wishing Tree, a lonely, leafless sentinel in winter that stood directly opposite the wall of windows in this very common room. My head lifted slowly, as if against a great weight, and I let my eyes be dragged across the glowing chaos of the party, through the reflection of tinsel and swirling lights, to the dark glass panes that looked out onto the frozen night. At first, I saw only the faint reflection of the room behind me, a ghostly overlay of merriment. I blinked, forcing my vision to adjust, to see past the reflection into the true darkness beyond. And there, beneath the stark, sprawling branches of the wishing tree, I saw him. He was a study in absolute stillness, a silhouette cut from the deeper black of the night. He wore no bulky coat against the cold, just what appeared to be a dark jacket of ordinary weight. He was not pacing, not stamping his feet for warmth, not looking at his phone. He was perfectly, unnaturally still, facing the building, facing me. The distance was too great to see his face, but the posture of his head, the slight forward tilt of his torso, communicated a focused attention that slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The noise of the party behind me didn't just fade. It was vacuumed away, replaced by a roaring silence in my ears where only the frantic hammering of my own heart remained. The note in my hand was no longer just paper. It was a confirmed truth, a direct line to a waiting nightmare. My breath fogged the cold window pane for a second, obscuring him, and when it cleared, he hadn't moved a millimeter. He was waiting. The warning was explicit. Do not walk alone. But standing here, a clear target in a lit window, felt just as perilous. I jerked back from the glass, my shoulder colliding with someone who grunted in annoyance, the sound snapping me back into the noisy world. I crumpled the note into a tiny, hard ball, clutching it in my fist like a talisman, as if its physical presence could shield me from the reality it confirmed. My immediate, animal instinct was to flee the line of sight, to bury myself in the densest part of the herd. I turned and pushed into the crowd, my movements now fueled by a sharp, electric fear. I needed to find a face I knew, to anchor myself to something normal. That's when I saw the second man. He was inside, tall, with a sharpness to his features that seemed out of place among the soft, smiling student faces. He stood apart near the fire exit, not drinking, not talking. And he was looking directly at me. Our eyes met across the boiling room, and in his gaze was none of the vacant cheer of the partygoers, nor the predatory focus of the silhouette outside. His was a look of cold, clinical observation, the look of a scientist noting the behavior of a specimen. A shiver, colder than any I'd felt outside, ripped through me. I quickly averted my eyes, the old superstition that eye contact invites danger screaming in my hindbrain. When I dared a glance back half a minute later, the space by the fire exit was empty. He was gone, vanished. But the feeling of being watched did not dissipate. It doubled, coming now from 2 points, the known threat outside and the phantom that had just evaporated inside. The rest of the party became a blur of sustained, high-alert terror. Every laugh was a potential decoy, every touch a fresh threat. I positioned myself in the absolute center of the room, my back to a pillar, rotating slowly like a paranoid radar dish, trying to watch all approaches at once. I saw neither man again, not the watcher at the tree when I stole terrified glances, nor the tall observer inside. But their absence was no relief. It meant they were unaccounted for. They could be anywhere. The note's command echoed in a loop. Do not walk to your dorm alone. Do not walk to your dorm alone. When the party's official end was called and the crowd began to spill out into the night, my panic peaked. Walking alone was unthinkable. The path to my dorm was a gauntlet of dark walkways, blind corners, and isolated stretches. Summoning every ounce of remaining social courage, I attached myself to 2 acquaintances from my sociology seminar, inventing a shaky story about a twisted ankle and the need for a stabilizing arm. Their cheerful, punch-loosened chatter during that 5-minute walk was the most surreal soundtrack imaginable to my silent, scanning vigilance. I saw nothing, heard nothing, but I felt the weight of the night pressing in from every shadow. Safely inside my room, door locked and chair wedged under the handle, I finally unfolded the crushed note again. In the calm, cold light of my desk lamp, I saw a detail I'd missed. Below the frantic script, almost invisible, was a tiny, smudged fingerprint in that same dark graphite. Someone, in a state of sheer terror, had held this paper while writing it. This was not a prank. It was a distress signal passed to me. But from whom? And why me? The question would haunt me long after the immediate fear faded. I never reported it. What would I say? The evidence was a crumpled note I could have written myself. The witness was my own unreliable perception. But the change was permanent. I never walked alone on campus at night again. The world had revealed itself to contain hidden channels of danger and cryptic communications between the hunted, and I had been unwillingly added to the network. Safely locked in my room with a chair wedged under the doorknob, the silence was now a different entity, no longer empty, but charged with the echoes of what had just happened. The crumpled note on my desk seemed to pulse under the stark light of my study lamp, a tiny, malevolent artifact from a world that had ruptured. My initial, shaking examination confirmed the graphite smudge was indeed a fingerprint, a fragile human mark left in a moment of panic, and this evidence of a real, terrified person, a potential ally in whatever this was, offered no comfort, only deeper confusion. Why choose me? Was I random, or was there something about my path across campus, my routine, my face in the crowd that had been selected? The questions coiled in my mind, feeding a new, obsessive phase. The following days were a performance of normalcy painted over a foundation of raw dread. I attended my final exams in a fog, my hand moving automatically to answer questions about economic theory or historical dates, while my primary consciousness was fixed on the exits, the windows, the other students' hands. Had any of them written the note? Was the tall man from the party sitting 2 rows ahead, now wearing the anonymous uniform of a hoodie and exhaustion? Every casual glance from a stranger felt loaded. Every distant figure standing under a tree on the quad made my heart stutter until I confirmed it was just someone waiting for a friend. I began mapping safe routes, paths that stayed under the brightest security lights, that avoided the sight lines from the wishing tree, that maximized the sound of my footsteps on gravel rather than silent grass. My formerly mundane walk from the library became a tactical exercise, a nightly infiltration through my own life. This hypervigilance soon fermented into a compulsive need for answers, a conviction that the truth was hidden in plain sight, waiting in the university's archives or in the whispered lore of the student body. I started a discreet, frantic research project, scouring local digital newspaper archives for any reports of strange occurrences on or near campus during the winter months. I found nothing about stalkers or notes, but a different pattern emerged, one that chilled me in a more abstract way. Articles, spaced years apart, about students found disoriented or in mild states of shock after late-night library sessions, their accounts dismissed as stress or sleep deprivation. One brief piece from 15 years prior mentioned a freshman who insisted a silent man had followed him from the commons to his dorm before vanishing. The comment section on the digital article was a graveyard of forgotten jokes, but one username had posted, "Happened to my roommate in '98. He dropped out." I stared at that sentence for an hour, the pixels blurring. It was a thread, thin and fragile, connecting my experience to a timeline, suggesting a recurrence, a pattern that existed below the official record. This wasn't a one-time event. It was a rhythm. Armed with this unsettling notion, I began the riskier work of listening, of gently steering conversations with longtime campus workers, the all-night diner cashier, the ancient groundskeeper who pruned the bushes around the wishing tree. I asked vague questions about campus legends, about things that felt off. Most shrugged with friendly indifference, but the groundskeeper, an old man with hands like gnarled wood, paused his trimming when I mentioned the tree. He looked at me, not through me, for the first time. "Bad place to be after dark," he muttered, not looking at the tree but at the soil near its roots. "Things get held there. Roots go deep into old things." He refused to elaborate, returning to his clipping with a finality that ended the conversation, but his words cemented the tree's significance. It wasn't just a landmark, it was an active site. The note's warning had created a prison of fear, but this newfound sense of a hidden pattern created a different kind of trap, the investigator's trap. I was no longer just a victim. I was a participant, hooked by the mystery. I began taking long, daytime walks to the wishing tree, circling it in the cold daylight, studying its bark for clues it would never give. I took photographs of the common room windows from the tree's perspective, trying to gauge sightlines. This activity, I rationalized, was reclaiming power, but in reality, it was tying me tighter to the geography of my own fear. And then, the environment began to reflect my obsession back at me. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench far from the tree, pretending to read, I saw a girl, maybe a freshman, standing alone under its branches. She wasn't looking at the tree. She was staring, motionless, toward the common room windows, her posture a mirror image of the watchers from my night. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me. Was she another victim? Was she the watcher? As I watched, frozen, she suddenly looked down at her phone, smiled, and walked briskly away, a perfectly normal student. The incident left me shaken, questioning my own perception. Was I projecting the horror onto innocent scenes? The line between genuine threat and paralyzing paranoia began to dissolve, making the world itself feel untrustworthy. The final exam period ended, and the campus emptied for the winter break. Most students fled to the warmth of home, but I stayed, giving my parents an excuse about an independent study project. The truth was I couldn't leave. The mystery was here, in the silent, snow-blanketed buildings and the lonely paths. The empty campus was a magnifying glass for my fear, but also a laboratory. I felt a dreadful pull to recreate the circumstances, to walk the path from the commons to my dorm alone at the exact same hour, to see if the presence would manifest again for an audience of one. It was an insane thought, born of isolation and spiraling fixation. I never did it. The rational fear of what might happen was still stronger than the obsessive need to know. Instead, I haunted the empty commons building at night, the cleaning staff's vacuums my only company, staring out the same window. The wishing tree stood alone in the snow, a black fractal against the white, never with a figure beneath it. The absence of the watcher was now just as haunting as his presence had been. It meant the phenomenon wasn't constant. It was conditional. It was tied to the party, to the crowd, to me in that specific moment. The break stretched on. A month of long, silent nights where I felt like the last person left in a museum of recent trauma. I ate meals in near-empty dining halls, the echoes of laughter from the party now replaced by the clatter of my own cutlery. I started dreaming of the note, but in the dreams, I was the one writing it, my hand moving uncontrollably, the graphite digging into the paper until it caught fire. I would wake up with my heart pounding, the taste of smoke in my mouth. The experience was no longer just a memory. It had metabolized, becoming part of my subconscious landscape. By the time the first waves of students began trickling back for the new semester, I was a ghost of my former self. Pale, sleep-deprived, jumping at the sound of a slamming car door. I had sought answers and found only deeper, more fractal questions. The note had promised a specific danger, a he at the tree. But the true horror it unleashed was vaguer, more pervasive. It was the horror of a shattered assumption that the world operates on a set of visible, understandable rules. That horror whispered that there were patterns in the darkness, rituals played out on unsuspecting people. And once you became aware of the game, you could never stop looking for the other players or wondering when your turn would come again. The party was over, but the watch had just begun, and I was now a permanent sentry on the walls of my own mind, staring out at a world that could never again look wholly innocent or safe. The return of the student body for the spring semester draped a thin veneer of normalcy over the campus, but for me, it was like watching ghosts re-inhabit a haunted house. Their laughter and bustling energy seemed to pass through the solid reality of my fear without touching it. I moved through the first days of classes like a sleepwalker, my notes filled less with lecture material and more with involuntary sketches of tree branches and watching eyes. The shared excitement over new schedules and reunions created a social static that I could hide within. Yet every crowded hallway felt like the commons on that night, every cluster of people a potential camouflage for a tall, observing figure. My research had hit a wall. The digital trail had gone cold, and the groundskeeper now avoided me entirely. The mystery was stagnating, and in that stagnation, the fear began to mutate from a sharp, immediate panic into a dull, chronic condition, a kind of paranoid background radiation in my life. I began to study my own past for clues, wondering if some forgotten childhood incident or a family secret had somehow marked me for this attention. But this introspection only led in dizzying circles. The isolation of knowing, of carrying this unverifiable, weightless secret, became its own prison. I considered confessing everything to a campus counselor, but the fear of being labeled delusional, of having my reality professionally invalidated, was ultimately greater than the fear of the watcher himself. So, I carried the secret like a hidden rot, and it shaped my actions in subtle, corrosive ways. I declined evening study groups. I never took a campus job that ended after dark. My social circle shrunk to those I could trust to walk with me without asking too many questions. This self-imposed quarantine from ordinary college life, however, created a vacuum, and nature, especially the kind I was tangling with, abhors a vacuum. The next escalation came not at night, but in the clear, sober light of a Tuesday afternoon. I was leaving the geology building, my mind pleasantly numb from an hour of memorizing mineral hardness scales, when I saw a flash of white on the ground near the base of the wishing tree. It was a crumpled food wrapper, nothing more, but the sight pulled me like a magnet, against every instinct screaming that this was the heart of the danger zone. I found myself walking toward it, my footsteps silent on the damp grass. Standing on that same spot where the figure had stood, I felt a profound, icy hollowness, as if the very air was thinner. I looked up at the common room windows, now reflecting only the flat gray sky, and saw my own small, indistinct reflection. It was then I noticed the bark. At eye level, on the massive trunk facing the building, the thick gray bark was scarred not with natural fissures, but with deliberate, shallow markings. They were faint, weathered, and at first glance seemed like random damage from a forgotten piece of equipment. But as I traced them with my eyes, patterns emerged. Not words, but sequences. A series of short, parallel gouges grouped in fives, a crooked circle with a line through it, what looked like a crude hourglass shape. They were glyphs. My breath caught. This was not imagination. This was physical data. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling not with fear now, but with a terrible, electrifying vindication. As I took pictures, zooming in, on each set of marks, I noticed something else. Nestled in a deep crevice where a branch had long ago fallen away was a small, dark cavity. Without thinking, I reached in. My fingers brushed against something dry and papery. I snatched my hand back, a full-body shudder running through me. After a frantic glance around the empty quad, I reached in again, more slowly, and extracted not one, but several small, rolled cylinders of paper, tied with brittle bits of string. They were like ancient scrolls. Unrolling the first with exquisite care, I found it blank. The second, however, held a single, faded word written in pencil: wait. The third had a date from the previous autumn, and below it, the latitude and longitude coordinates for our campus. The final scrap held a tiny, meticulous drawing of the tree itself, with a small X on the side facing the buildings. The shock was absolute. This was a cache, a dead drop. The watcher didn't just stand here. He used this place. And these notes, they weren't warnings to someone like me. They were records or instructions left for someone else. The narrative in my mind shattered and reassembled in a more terrifying configuration. This wasn't a single predator stalking a random victim. This was an operation, a ritual, a recurring process with a history, a geography, and a methodology. The tall man in the party wasn't a second threat. He was likely the other participant, the one who retrieved or placed these messages. The note in my pocket wasn't a desperate attempt to save me. It was an anomaly, a misfire. Perhaps it was meant for someone else and I was given it by mistake. Or perhaps, in a twist that made my skin crawl, I was meant to find it, and finding this cache was the next step. The feeling of being a chosen specimen returned, multiplied 100-fold. I wasn't just being watched. I was being led. I carefully replaced the scrolls exactly as I found them, the act feeling both sacrilegious and necessary. I had to leave no trace that I'd discovered this. As I walked away, the tree no longer felt like a passive landmark of my fear, but an active, pulsing organ in something much larger. The campus around me transformed in that moment. Every Gothic archway looked like a pointed tooth. Every tunnel-like passage between buildings felt like a gullet. The university wasn't a place where this horror was happening. The university, in some way I couldn't yet grasp, was part of the horror's architecture. The discovery of the cache broke the paralysis of my fear and replaced it with the frantic energy of a hunted animal that has finally seen the outline of the trap. I stopped looking for answers in the past and began watching the present with a new surgical precision. I became a fixed point of observation. From various library windows, coffee shop corners, and benches with strategic sightlines, I conducted surveillance on the wishing tree. I noted the times the groundskeeper tended the flower beds around it, never getting too close to the trunk itself. I logged the patterns of students who used it as a meeting point, their behaviors breezy and normal, none of them ever glancing at the markings. For 2 weeks, nothing. Then, on a damp, foggy morning before my 8 a.m. class, I saw him. Not the original watcher, but the tall man from the party. He was dressed in ordinary clothes, dark jeans, a charcoal peacoat, and he walked with a purposeful, unhurried stride directly to the tree. He didn't glance around furtively. He moved with the calm assurance of someone performing a routine task. He stood with his back to me, his body blocking the cavity from my view for perhaps 15 seconds. When he stepped away and walked briskly toward the humanities building, the cavity, from my distant vantage point, looked unchanged. He had exchanged something. A transaction had been completed. The normalcy of his actions, the bureaucratic mundanity of it, was more horrifying than any supernatural manifestation. This was a chore, a part of someone's daily schedule. The horror had a coffee break. I didn't follow him. The instinct to remain unseen, to not become a variable in this established equation, was overpowering. I sat frozen on the bench, the fog condensing on my jacket, understanding finally dawning. I was not the prey in a hunt. I was a bystander who had accidentally glimpsed the mechanics of a vast, slow-moving machine. The note, the watcher, the tall man, they were all cogs. The machine was concerned with a process I could not comprehend, and my intense personal terror was merely a negligible byproduct, a speck of dust thrown from a grinding gear. This realization brought a strange, hollow peace. The fear did not vanish, but it lost its personal, predatory intimacy. It became atmospheric, a condition of the world like weather. I started sleeping through the night again. I began to focus, as best I could, on my classes. The memory of the party and the desperate investigation that followed began to recede, not because it was resolved, but because it was contextualized into something too large to fight. I avoided the tree not with panic, but with the same detached caution one gives to a high-voltage station. The machine was there. It was operating. And as long as I did not interfere, as long as I was not mistakenly fed into its works again, I could exist alongside it. The last vestige of the experience was the note itself. I kept the original, crumpled paper, not in my desk, but sealed inside a book of poetry I never opened. It was a relic, a token from the night I learned that the world is not just haunted by ghosts, but by systems, and that the most terrifying systems are the ones that work quietly, efficiently, and forever in plain sight. The realization that I was adjacent to a mechanism rather than the subject of a singular haunting brought a seismic shift in my internal landscape. The frantic, animal fear that had governed my every move for months began to recede, not into calm, but into a state of cold, clinical observation. The campus no longer felt like a hunting ground. It felt like a complex apparatus whose true function was hidden behind the mundane facade of lectures and exams. I became an ethnographer of the uncanny, studying the rhythms of the machine I had stumbled upon. My focus shifted from the why me to the how and when. I kept a meticulous, coded log, not a diary of fear, but a field journal. I noted the weather on days I suspected an exchange at the tree, the foggy morning, then a drizzly afternoon 3 weeks later. I charted the moon phases against my own sense of ambient dread, finding no correlation, which somehow made it worse. This wasn't celestial, it was bureaucratic. I began to see the university itself through a new, fractured lens. The grandiose founding dates carved over doorways, the portraits of severe-looking benefactors, the very architecture of authority and tradition. All of it seemed like the perfect shell for something older and less nameable. I started auditing lectures far outside my major: folklore, local history, obscure branches of sociology about institutional rituals. In a dusty, rarely visited section of the library stacks, I found a master's thesis from the 1970s on liminal spaces in urban campus design. The author briefly discussed the wishing tree quadrant, citing it as a classic example of a vestigial zone, a space that escapes formal design purpose and thus accumulates unofficial uses. The phrase "accumulates unofficial uses" was underlined in my copy, the pencil digging into the margin. Was that the academic term for a dead-drop site for unseen operations? This intellectualization was my armor. By framing the horror in analytical terms, I could keep its emotional reality at bay. I stopped dreaming of the note and started dreaming of diagrams, of schematics where the tree was a node in a vast, pulsing network of lines connecting all the campus buildings. The tall man became Asset A, the Watcher, Phenomenon B. I even gave the machine a name in my private notes: the Silent Curriculum. It was a joke, but one that didn't make me smile. The true cost of this coping strategy was a profound and deepening alienation. I listened to my friends debate professors and parties and felt like an anthropologist from a future century, marveling at their charming, simple concerns. My own studies in economics felt absurdly trivial, like learning the rules of a board game while a real war raged silently outside the window. I was becoming what I observed: detached, systematic, a recorder of patterns. I wondered if this was the machine's true purpose: not to terrorize, but to recruit observers, to turn the sensitive into permanent silent sentries by showing them a glimpse of the gears. The next tangible event occurred during finals of that spring semester. Stress hung over the campus like a chemical mist, and the library was a cavern of quiet desperation. I was there late, chasing the fading tail of comprehension for a statistics course, when I felt the old specific prickling at my neck. It wasn't panic. It was recognition. I carefully closed my book and scanned the reading room. There, 3 tables away, was a freshman I vaguely recognized from the dorm. He was pale, staring not at his textbook, but into the middle distance, his pen trembling slightly in his hand. On the edge of his notebook, I saw it. A small, crumpled ball of paper, identical in size and texture to the one I had received. He hadn't opened it. He was just staring at it, as if it were a live insect. A sympathetic horror, cold and clear, washed through me. The machine was cycling. It had selected a new recipient. The baton of dread was being passed. I watched as he finally, with agonizing slowness, reached out and smoothed the paper. I couldn't see his face as he read it, but I saw his shoulders hunch, his head drop. He looked, in that moment, exactly like me. A part of me screamed to go to him, to whisper that I knew, that he wasn't crazy. But a stronger, colder part held me back. Interfering could be dangerous, could break the pattern in unpredictable ways, draw attention to us both. I had become a custodian of the machine's mystery, and my prime directive was now to not disturb its operation. I gathered my things and left the library, leaving him alone with his new, shattered reality. As I walked back to my dorm in the dark, the old fear returned, but it was for him, not for me. I had graduated from victim to witness. It was not a promotion. The summer provided a physical escape but no mental reprieve. At home, surrounded by the comfortable relics of my childhood, the entire experience took on the quality of a fever dream. The tree, the notes, the tall man, they seemed ludicrous in the suburban sunlight. I almost convinced myself it had all been an elaborate psychotic break born of stress. But in the quiet of my bedroom at night, I would open the encrypted file on my laptop containing the photos of the tree glyphs and the scan of my own note. The evidence was irrefutable. It had happened. The machine was real, and it was still running back on campus with a new student now caught in its works. I spent the summer reading about informational pathologies, mimetic hazards, and thought forms, concepts that danced around the edges of what I'd experienced but never quite captured its cold, systematic reality. I was no closer to an answer, but I had built a sturdier mental cage for the question. Returning for my final year felt like stepping back onto a stage for a play whose script I only partially knew. The campus was the same, but I was irrevocably changed. I saw the latent geometry of control in the pathways, the way sightlines were engineered, how certain spaces naturally funneled people past certain points. The wishing tree was just the most obvious node. I began to identify others. A particular stone bench that was always in shadow, a forgotten archway between two older buildings, a specific spot on the library's fourth-floor stacks that felt perpetually watched. I avoided them all, not with superstition but with strategy. The freshman from the library, I learned, had withdrawn from the university for personal reasons over the summer. The machine had processed him and spat him out. I wondered what his breaking point had been, and if he, like me, was now a carrier of the silent knowledge. My own mission, self-imposed and grim, solidified. Get my degree and leave. Do not investigate further. Do not interfere. Document only for my own sanity, and then sever all connection. The university was no longer an alma mater. It was a host organism for a parasite I could not define, and my only goal was to graduate from it without being consumed. The fear had finally crystallized into a plan, and with that plan came a fragile, weary kind of peace. I was no longer waiting for the horror to find me again. I was simply waiting to leave its territory, hoping it would let me go, and knowing, in a chamber of my heart I rarely visited, that I would spend the rest of my life listening for the quiet, efficient hum of similar machines in every institution I ever encountered again.